My name is Ethan. Ethan Cole. Just half a year ago my world smelled like expensive cologne. A brand new ride, freshly brewed coffee from an overpriced cafe, and the faint but unmistakable scent of money. I was the king of my own little universe. CEO of a booming IT startup that my best friend and partner Steve and I had built from scratch. We were riding the wave, big contracts, glowing articles in tech magazines, ambitious plans to expand overseas. I rented a sleek apartment in downtown Seattle, changed phones more often than jackets, and genuinely believed I had life figured out. And then life decided to flip the board. One fine Monday, I woke up to find all company accounts drained, the office padlocked for unpaid bills, and Steve, my college buddy, the man I would have trusted with my life, was gone. Disappeared with the money, client base, and every shared dream we ever had. He left me with only one thing: debt. Massive, crushing debt owed to investors, banks, and some very serious people who didn't care much for courts and preferred methods straight out of the mob handbook. My world collapsed in hours. Phone calls turned from flattering to threatening. Fancy restaurants became greasy diners in a cheap rental on the outskirts. The smell of money was replaced by the stench of fear. Sticky, ever-present fear. I flinched at every knock on the door, every unknown caller ID. One night in a dark stairwell, two polite but heavy-set guys made it crystal clear. The clock was ticking, and the interest could prove fatal to my health. That was rock bottom. Scrolling through job sites in a desperate haze, I stumbled across it. A listing that felt like it had slipped in from another century. Wanted, ranger for private hunting grounds. Location, northern Alaska boreal forest. High pay, full isolation. Contract minimum 1 year. Radio contact only. And then the kicker, like it was written just for me. Forest experience not required. What matters most? Psychological resilience and the ability to endure long periods of complete solitude. Solitude. After Steve's betrayal, it sounded less like punishment and more like salvation. And the salary, the kind of money they were offering, wasn't just a lifeline. It could buy me a new life altogether. I clung to that ad like a drowning man to driftwood. The interview wasn't in some shiny office tower, but in a smoke-stained little office on the edge of town. I was met by Sheriff Dawson, a man in his 50s with the face of someone who'd worked outdoors his whole life. His handshake was rough, his gaze weighing me like a piece of lumber. He didn't ask much about my skills. His questions were simpler. "You ever serve in the military?" "No." "Too bad. They teach you to endure. You'll need a lot of that out there. Silence, loneliness, yourself. The site's remote 90 miles from the nearest town as the crow flies. Supply drop by helicopter twice a year. Only contact is radio with the next ranger cabin. No internet. No calling mom. Think you can handle that?" I nodded, trying to look confident. "The last guy couldn't," Dawson said, fiddling with a pack of cheap cigarettes he never lit. "Old man Harris, tough son of a gun, pushing 70 but could outhike most young bucks. 30 years in that cabin, then one day quit. Said he was done, wanted to see his grandkids. We sent for him, he didn't even pack his stuff, just left. Strange as hell, but the land can't go untended. Without a ranger, poachers move in. The job pays well, but the rules are strict. 1 year, no early outs. Contracts binding, you up for it?" Something about his words scraped at the back of my mind. Harris's sudden exit, the heavy emphasis on isolation. But the voices of my creditors were louder, drowning out doubt. "I'm in," I said firmly. A week later, I was bouncing in the passenger seat of a beat-up old Ford pickup, heading north into the endless forest. Behind the wheel was a grim, unshaven guy named Paul. My new life lay ahead. We had been driving for over 6 hours. Pavement had turned to gravel, then to a rough forest trail, and for the last stretch it felt like only Paul knew where the hell we were going. The old Ford growled and rattled as it climbed over roots and ruts. Civilization slipped further away with every mile. The last bar of cell signal had vanished at least 3 hours ago. "Are we close?" I asked, just to break the suffocating silence. Paul glanced at me, then spat out the cracked window. "Almost there. But listen, city boy, you didn't know old man Harris. I drove him out here for 30 years. 30, you get that? He wasn't the type to quit. That man was welded to these woods. Always said he'd suffocate in a city inside a week. And then suddenly, just like that, he leaves, says he wants to be with his grandkids." Paul cursed under his breath. "Bullshit. Something ain't right. Keep your ears sharp out here. The forest doesn't joke around." His words sank deep into the fertile soil of my unease. When the truck finally lurched to a stop on a small clearing by a fast, dark river, I climbed out and froze. Before me stretched not just forest, but an endless wall of the Alaskan wilderness, towering spruces and pines thick as fortress columns, holding up a heavy gray sky. The air was so sharp and cold it felt solid. And the silence, it wasn't just the absence of sound. It was tangible, pressing in on my eardrums, filling my lungs. On the riverbank stood the ranger cabin, squat, log-built, weathered black with age. My home for the next year. Paul helped me unload the sacks of food, the crates of canned goods and supplies. "Radio on the table," he muttered, tossing empty fuel cans into the truck bed. "Check in every 3 days. Jack Fenton, ranger on the southern post, will be listening. He's about 9 miles straight through the forest. Only neighbor you got. If anything happens, he's the one you call. Well, good luck, Cole. Try not to get lost out here." The Ford groaned, turned, and disappeared back into the green silence. I was alone, alone with the boreal forest, with the cabin that smelled of other men's secrets, and with the snowballing weight of unease pressing on my chest. Taking a deep breath, I pushed forward. The cabin door groaned open, releasing a draft of air heavy with smoke, pine, and old loneliness. Inside it was bare and Spartan. A massive wood stove took up a quarter of the room. Wide bunks lined the walls. In the corner stood a rough-hewn table with a couple of stools. Across from the stove, a bed with a lumpy mattress and a gray wool blanket. Everything screamed of sudden departure. A tin mug with moldy tea sat abandoned on the table. A faded storm jacket still hung from a nail. A single boot lay discarded in the corner. I unpacked slowly, trying to claim the space as my own. Set my books on a shelf, placed my mug and plate on the table. I needed to root myself here, otherwise this place would swallow me whole. Searching for a rag to wipe the table, I pulled open the only drawer in the old desk. It was nearly empty. A few rusty fishing hooks, some line, an old pocket knife. And beneath all that junk lay a notebook. A school-style composition book, battered, its corners bent, the cardboard cover stained with dark blotches that looked disturbingly like dried blood. On the cover, in a shaky, uneven hand, as if written by someone whose fingers no longer obeyed him, were the words, "The Ranger's Journal." I smirked. Probably Harris jotting down notes when the geese returned where a bear left tracks. I opened it expecting that. But the very first page knocked the ground out from under me. No dates, no field notes. Only a single title, scrawled so hard the ink bled through the paper. RULES. I sat down on the creaking stool, laying the notebook under the dim glow of the kerosene lamp I'd lit. This wasn't a journal. It was an instruction manual left behind for the next poor bastard. Rule 1. Patrol your section only in daylight. Be back in the cabin before dusk. Never, do you hear me, never stay out in the forest after dark. At night, the woods aren't the same. They wake up and you don't want to see them for what they really are. I forced a skeptical smile. Safety basics, right? Don't wander in the dark, don't risk a bear encounter. Made sense. I flipped the page. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Rule 2. North of your post, past Black Creek, there's an old pine grove. Rusty traps there, been sitting since my grandfather's day. Don't go near them. Not ever. Even if you think you hear crying. Especially if it's a woman's cry. That's not bait for animals. A woman's cry, bait. My rational mind faltered. My mouth went dry. This was no safety tip. It read like madness, or worse, like testimony. Rule 3. Check the bolt on your cabin door once a week. It must slide easy but lock tight. Oil it. Can of grease is under the stove in the far corner. This might save your life. I glanced at the iron bolt across the door. Solid enough. But the thought that my survival might depend on it made my heart thud faster. Bears. That's what the rifle was for. So who or what was I supposed to be locking out? Rule 4. If deep in the night when everything is dead silent, you hear a faint bell ringing, don't waste a second. Lock the door. Kill the lamp. Don't go near the window. Don't try to see who's out there. Just wait for dawn. Whatever you hear, scratching, whispering, begging, don't open up. It will pass. A bell out here. I scrambled for logic. Wind in the eaves, maybe a lost pack animal. But what animal, out here? And the last line chilled me more than the rule itself. It will pass. Not the sound will stop. It will leave. Rule 5. The fog here rolls in thick as milk and without warning. If you find yourself caught in it and you hear someone calling your name, don't answer. Not a sound. Hide and wait. Never answer the voice in the mist. It hunts by sound, not by sight. A bead of sweat rolled down my temple. Too precise, too detailed. And that last line, it hunts by sound, not by sight, read like something torn out of some ancient folklore. Harris had written it like a man who had lived through it, more than once. I turned a few more pages. The rules were becoming stranger and more terrifying. 6. The old bathhouse by the river is boarded up. Do not try to open it, especially after midnight. Whatever is locked inside must stay there. 7. If you find a fresh barefoot human footprint on the trail, immediately return to the outpost. Do not try to figure out whose it is. It is tracking you, not the other way around. The last rule was circled several times in bold. 8. Do not trust a voice on the radio if it says help is nearby and you didn't call for it. It's a trap. I slammed the notebook shut with force. My hands were trembling. Was this some kind of prank? An elaborate joke for a rookie? But who could have set it up? Dawson. Why? It was far too complicated and terrifying to be a simple prank. There was only one other possibility. Old man Harris, after years of solitude, had simply gone mad. His mind could not bear it and had filled the forest with ghosts and monsters. That seemed like the most logical explanation. I stood up and paced the cabin. I went to the door and pulled the bolt. It moved with a dry creak. I bent down and looked under the stove. In the farthest dusty corner sat a small tin can. I opened it. Inside was thick, dark grease. Coincidence, just a coincidence. I stepped out onto the porch. Twilight was already thickening over the forest. The river had darkened. In the distance, about 100 meters away, right at the water's edge, I made out a crooked structure, the old bathhouse. Its door was nailed shut with two planks crossed like an X. My skepticism crumbled to dust. This was no joke, no delusion. I was in a place governed by strange, terrifying laws. This notebook was the only survival manual. In the evening before going to bed, I didn't just lock the door with a latch. I slid the heavy forged bolt all the way shut. Just for peace of mind, I lied to myself. But I knew that wasn't the truth. I did it because, for the first time in my life, I was truly scared. The first night at the outpost became torture. My brain, accustomed to the constant hum of the metropolis, the noise of cars outside, the fridge's buzz and shouts from the street, could not adapt to this deafening absolute silence. It didn't calm me, it oppressed me. It was a living substance, seeping into my ears, my thoughts, forcing me to hear the beating of my own heart like blows of a cathedral bell. Every crack of a cooling log in the stove, every rustle behind the log walls, every owl's hoot in the night forest sounded like a gunshot, making me jump and curl into the lumpy mattress. Sleep would not come. I tossed from side to side, listening to the dense velvet darkness outside the window. The images from the diary danced before my eyes. A woman crying in a clearing with traps, barefoot tracks on the trail, a man calling from the fog. I tried to convince myself it was just an overactive imagination, but it didn't help. 3 hours probably passed. I had already resigned myself to sleeplessness and decided to get up to make tea and sit by the dying stove until dawn. I swung my legs off the bed, feeling for my boots on the floor, and froze. Through the cottony silence, a sound broke through. It was so thin, so distant, that at first I thought it was ringing in my ears. But no, the sound repeated, this time a little clearer. I froze, turning rigid, my whole being tensed. My heart skipped a beat and then started racing wildly. It was the thin, melodic, almost crystalline chime of a small bell. It came from the river, from the dark strip of forest. The sound was not chaotic, as if produced by the wind. No, it was measured, rhythmic, as if someone or something was moving slowly, and at each step the bell responded with its chilling, soul-freezing tone. A line from the notebook flashed in fiery letters in my mind. If you hear a bell at night, immediately bolt the door. The door, I remembered with relief that I had locked it as soon as it got dark. That simple fact now seemed more reliable than any fortress wall. I sat on the bed, unable to move, paralyzed by primal terror. I just listened. The chime grew louder, closer. Whoever was coming did not hide. They were moving straight toward my cabin. My brain frantically tried to find a rational explanation. A lost horse. But where would a horse come from here? Maybe Jack Fenton, the neighbor, decided to visit and play a prank. But why? And why did an old man, a hardened forest ranger, write about it with such horror? The sound was already at the porch itself. I pressed against the wall, holding my breath. My eyes were fixed on the dark rectangle of the door. I waited for a strike, the scraping of claws, an attempt to break the lock, but nothing happened. The chime simply stopped. It stood right outside the door, just a couple of meters from me. And then came silence. This silence was 1,000 times more terrifying than the chime itself. It was filled with someone's presence, waiting. The invisible night visitor stood on my porch and waited. I felt its presence on my skin. It waited for me to make a mistake, to give in to curiosity, to look out the window. Do not approach the window and do not try to see who is there. I forced myself to look away from the small window, behind which the starless night was black. I sat like stone, afraid to make the slightest creak. Time stopped. Minutes stretched into a sticky, suffocating eternity. And then I heard a new sound, faint, barely audible, a rustle, as if someone slowly, almost tenderly, ran their fingertips along the log wall of the cabin. From this sound the hairs on my head stood on end, and then a slow, heavy, inhuman sigh, too deep for human lungs. Then again footsteps, slow, receding, and along with them the bell's chime returned. It grew quieter and quieter, retreating back into the forest, until it finally disappeared into the night's silence. I did not close my eyes until morning. I sat, clutching the prickly blanket, staring at the door, at the massive forged bolt that separated me from the nightmarish terror. My urban skepticism had been destroyed, burned to ashes by the icy fire of fear. This was no joke. This was not the product of a sick imagination. The rules were not written by a madman. They were written by someone who knew what they were dealing with. And one of those rules which I had followed only out of caution had just, without a doubt, saved my life. When the first pale rays of the sun filtered through the window, I did not feel relief. I felt the icy grip of realization. I was trapped here for a year, and every night it could return. With the first rays of sun, I, staggering from exhaustion and the horror I had experienced, forced myself to approach the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the bolt. Sliding it aside, I cautiously opened the door and looked outside. Morning was clear and cold. Dew sparkled on the grass. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. Nothing suggested the night visit. I carefully stepped off the porch. The damp, soft earth around the cabin was untouched. No tracks, human or animal, absolutely nothing, as if the night visitor had hovered above the ground. This lack of evidence was even more terrifying than the nightmare itself. It made it unreal, mystical, beyond logic. I spent the whole day in feverish activity. I chopped wood with such fury that each blow of the axe seemed aimed at my fear itself. I checked the animal salt licks, cleared the trails, but never ventured more than a kilometer from the cabin. The boreal forest had changed. It was no longer just a beautiful and harsh wilderness. Now it felt hostile, watchful, every tree hiding a potential threat. I jumped at every snap of a branch, every bird's cry. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling an invisible gaze on the back of my neck. By noon, I realized I couldn't endure this silence any longer. I needed to hear a human voice, to be sure I wasn't the only person in this cursed Alaskan wilderness. The vintage radio on the table looked like the only thread connecting me to the outside world. I flicked the switch, and the room filled with the soothing crackle and hiss of the airwaves. On a piece of paper taped to the radio in Old Man Harris's trembling handwriting was written, "Purity." "Base Clearwater calling south," I said into the transmitter. My own voice sounded hoarse and foreign. "Jack, can you hear me? Over." The reply didn't come immediately. A few seconds of drawn-out static, then a confident, lively baritone cut through the interference. "South here, I hear you Clearwater like you're in the next room. Greetings, Ethan, give my regards to Jack's gear. How's it going, city boy?" A wave of almost childlike relief washed over me. Jack Fenton's voice sounded reliable, familiar, grounding. He was real. "Hi, Jack," settling in slowly. "The place is impressive, that's for sure, and there's more to come," he laughed openly and warmly. "This isn't city traffic you're stuck in. The forest has its own rules. Nature, mother, how was your first night? No local spirits bothering you? No Bigfoots coming to introduce themselves. His question caught me off guard. Was he joking or was there something more? I decided to be cautious. If I told him about the bell, he'd definitely think I was crazy. Sleep was uneasy, I replied evasively. Strange sounds behind the walls, probably just getting used to it. That's classic, Jack responded good-naturedly. Every newcomer goes through it. The forest is alive, it breathes, it creaks. A tree groans, an animal passes, wind whistles through a pipe. At first, half the people here see ghosts everywhere. Old Man Harris, your predecessor in the end, went completely off the rails. He kept seeing hunter ghosts, forest spirits, even hearing bells at night. Can you imagine, poor guy? I froze, gripping the cold plastic of the transmitter. A chill ran through me despite the warmth from the stove. Bells, he knows. Really? I managed to whisper, forcing my voice not to tremble. And what do you think it was? Who can say? Jack's voice was completely unconcerned. Old folks in remote towns tell tales about the forest's guardian spirit. They say he walks at night with his bell, checking his domain. Whoever sees or hears him too close is in trouble, but that's all children's tales. Most likely it's just the wind moving some debris making the sound. Just don't let it bother you. Work by day, sleep well at night, and everything will be fine. If you need anything serious, tools or advice, whistle. I've been here 5 years. I know all the trails and all the stories. Our conversation went on for another 10 minutes. Jack turned out to be an excellent companion. He explained the best spots to lay traps for rabbits, which lures worked for the northern pike here, and how to distinguish a lynx track from a wolf's. He seemed like a repository of boreal forest wisdom, experienced and completely sane. Yet his words about the bell and Old Man Harris planted an icy seed of doubt in my soul. He had so easily and confidently brushed it off as folklore and wind, but he confirmed that Harris had heard the same thing. That meant I hadn't gone mad. The threat was real. Jack either didn't believe in it himself or simply didn't want me to believe. When we ended the call, I felt worse, not better. I was even more alone than before. My connection to the outside world was an illusion. Jack, my only ally, was separated from me not just by 15 kilometers of forest, but by a wall of condescending skepticism. He had already labeled me as another city boy, scared of every rustle. I opened Old Man Harris's notebook again. The rules no longer seemed like the ramblings of a lunatic. They were a cry for help that no one had heard. I realized I would have to follow them with fanatical precision because I had no one else to trust. That evening, I didn't just lock the door. I took one of the heavy oak stools and wedged it against the door from the inside. You can never be too safe. A week passed, a week of grueling routine. I woke at dawn, went on patrol, returned after dark. I forced myself to work until I could barely stand, so by evening I would collapse into bed and sink into a dreamless, heavy sleep. The bell never returned. Gradually, I convinced myself that that night had been a one-time occurrence, a trick of my exhausted imagination, compounded by Harris's eerie notes. Fear dulled, replaced by a dull, draining anxiety. But the Alaskan wilderness had another test in store. One morning I woke to a strange silence. The sounds of the forest I had begun to get used to were gone. I went to the window and saw nothing. Beyond the glass was a dense, white, impenetrable wall fog. It had crept in quietly overnight and swallowed everything. It was so thick it seemed solid. Visibility was no more than 10 to 15 feet. I stepped onto the porch and felt as if I had been lowered to the bottom of a milky ocean. Damp, cold air seeped under my jacket. All sounds were muffled in the white shroud. My usual sense of isolation intensified 100-fold. I was blind. Patrolling in such weather would have been madness. I decided to work in the yard. I grabbed an axe and began chopping wood at the pile by the cabin wall. The rhythmic, dull thuds of the axe were the only sound in the cottony silence. I chopped and chopped, venting my tension on the logs, and suddenly I froze, raising the axe. Through the fog came another sound, a sharp snap of a dry branch, very close from the direction of the forest, about 20 meters away. I tensed, gripping the handle until my knuckles hurt. A bear, a moose, but I heard no breathing, no rustle of grass, just one clear snap, then silence. I stood motionless, my senses sharpened. My heart hammered in my chest, keeping a frantic rhythm. And then I heard a voice. Ethan. It was muffled by the fog, but I heard my name clearly. The voice was female. It sounded too close, as if the person were only a few steps away, hidden behind the white veil. Who's there? I whispered. A flash of Old Man Harris's fifth rule raced through my mind. If you find yourself in the fog and hear someone call your name, stay silent, don't respond. Ethan, help me. The voice came again, slightly to the left this time. It was moving. I'm lost. My instincts screamed, help the person. It could be a hiker, but the icy terror left over from the night of the bell clamped my tongue. The rule, Harris had written it for a reason. Hey, Ethan, I see you. The voice became more insistent, closer. What's the matter? Don't be afraid. I slowly started backing toward the safety of the cabin door, careful not to make a sound. The axe in my hand felt like a useless twig, and then I saw it. In the fog about 15 feet away, a dark silhouette swayed and took shape, blurry and indistinct like charcoal drawn on wet paper. A tall figure. It didn't move, it just stood there, staring in my direction. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a hallucination. Someone or something was out there in the fog trying to lure me away from the cabin, deeper into the forest, into the unknown. Come on, help me. The voice dripped with fake friendliness. I couldn't take it any longer. In 2 leaps I was on the porch, yanked the door shut, and slammed the heavy bolt down with a crash. Pressing against the wall, trying to calm the tremor that ran through my entire body. I crept to the window and peered out cautiously. Nothing, just the white, swirling haze. The figure was gone, the voice silenced as if it had never been there. I stayed in the locked cabin until evening, until the fog slowly began to lift, revealing the blackened trunks of the trees. Over and over I replayed what had happened, the voice, the silhouette. It wasn't a ghost or a forest spirit from Jack's stories. Ghosts don't snap branches underfoot or try to trick you into leaving. The threat in this forest was flesh and blood, cunning, calculating, ruthless, and it knew my name. After that foggy encounter, my fragile hope that this was all just a product of my imagination died completely. I realized I was under siege. An invisible enemy was studying me, testing my reactions, looking for weaknesses. Waiting passively for its next move would be the same as laying my head on the chopping block. I needed to figure out what I was dealing with. I needed answers. My investigation began with the only lead I had, the inheritance of Old Man Harris. I decided to conduct a thorough, meticulous search of the cabin. I tapped every floorboard, every wall panel. I rummaged through the attic, cluttered with old junk. I turned over all the belongings left by the old ranger. And then I found it. One of the boards under the bed caught my attention. When I stepped on it, it flexed slightly more than the others and made a hollow sound, as if there was a void beneath. Using the edge of my axe, I pried it loose from the joist with difficulty. Beneath the board, in a hollow carved into the massive log, lay a small bundle wrapped in an oil-stained rag. Heart hammering, I unwrapped it. Inside were several items that made me look at everything that had happened in a new light. First, a small pocket notebook, written in the same crooked handwriting as the forest diary. But here were not rules, only short, fragmented entries made in obvious haste. It was a chronicle of Old Man Harris's last days or weeks. September 12. Found a bed by the Black Creek, not animal, someone had slept, shells. September 15. Track by the river, double. One heavy boot, size 11, star-patterned tread, the other lighter but dragged, pulled something heavy. September 19. Out again at night, ringing his bell, checks if I'm in place. Bastard, thinks I'm asleep and hear nothing. September 22. Jack lies. September 25. He knows I know. September 27. North, traps of the old men, my last chance. I read the last entry several times. Jack, my only ally, my good-natured neighbor who had told me stories about forest spirits. My heart sank. The second item in the hideout was a handful of spent brass shells. Heavy, solid. I compared them to the ones I had for my Remington 700. Night and day. These were from a far more powerful, serious weapon. And the last, most terrifying find was an old, faded photograph. On it, two men, arm in arm, stood in front of this very cabin. One young, smiling Harris, the other a sturdy, bearded man with a sly, cheerful squint. I flipped the photo. On the back, in faded ink, was written, Harris and Jack, beginning of partnership. Ranger Post Dawson, 1999. I sat on the floor, surrounded by these dreadful clues, and the puzzle in my mind began to fit together. They had been friends, or at least partners. Years side by side in this remote wilderness, then something went wrong. Some goods, some smuggling, probably on an industrial scale. Harris had likely decided to leave the game or betray his partner, and Jack had decided to solve the problem. Everything fell into place. The sudden departure of Harris, Jack's lies over the radio, the bell, it wasn't mysticism. It was a signaling system, a way to check if I was home and not sticking my nose where it didn't belong. The voice in the fog, an attempt to lure me out and likely, quietly eliminate me, just like it had happened to Harris's predecessor. My investigation hadn't just raised new questions, it had delivered the single most terrifying answer. My enemy wasn't a ghost or a forest spirit. My enemy was human, experienced, cunning, knowing these woods like the back of his hand. A killer. And that killer was my only neighbor, my only connection to the outside world. I was trapped in a mouse trap, and the cat had already started hunting. The next day, I was scheduled to check in with Jack over the radio. The thought made my stomach turn. Talking to a man I now suspected of murdering his predecessor and planning the same for me was not for the faint-hearted. But I had to do it. I needed to play my role, the naive city boy who still believes in forest spirits and fears the dark. Any change in my behavior could tip him off. I had to test him, bait him, and watch his reaction. I switched on the radio, took several deep breaths to steady the tremor in my voice. South Post, Jack, you read me. This is Dawson. Loud and clear, his cheerful, almost irritatingly friendly baritone answered instantly. How's it going, neighbor? How were the fogs? Didn't get lost, did you? The question hit like a slap. He wasn't asking about the weather. He was checking if his trap had worked. Yeah, we made it through, thank God, I said, forcing relief into my tone. Terrifying, though. White wall everywhere, couldn't see a step ahead. I thought I heard someone nearby calling, but I figured it was my imagination and stayed inside. A pause hung in the speaker for a single second, but it felt deafening. Then Jack laughed, but the laughter was strained, false. Oh, that's the fatal call, as the old-timers say. A forest spirit lures you with your own voice. Good move staying put. Some folks fall for it. Harris, may he rest in peace, he would have walked right into it, trying to help, running deeper and deeper into the forest. Such a fool. He hadn't just confirmed local lore. He praised me for following the rule from the notebook, a rule I hadn't told him I was aware of. How could he have known I hadn't answered the call? It was undeniable proof. He was the one behind that fatal call. He had stood in the fog, waiting for my reaction. Blood pounded in my temples, but I forced myself to continue the act. Time to bait him. Listen, Jack, I was tidying up the cabin. Found something, old casings, probably left by Harris. Strange, big ones. Do you know what caliber that is? Pretty nasty, I guess. I described the shells from the hidden compartment. Silence fell over the radio again. Heavy, long, filled with static and my own uneven breathing. No idea, Jack finally said, and the warmth in his voice was gone. Cold, steel-like notes replaced it. Who knows what junk he messed with toward the end? Here's my advice. Throw that stuff in the river and forget about it. Don't trouble yourself with nonsense. Look, it isn't advice. It is an order. Yeah, probably right, I said as placidly as I could. Just curious. All right, Jack, won't keep you. Lots of work here. Over and out. Copy that. His voice was steady again, but the chill remained. And curb your curiosity. Around here, curious folks don't last long. Better off that way. The last sentence wasn't advice, it was an unmasked threat. I turned off the radio. My hands shook uncontrollably. The game was over. Masks dropped even if he thought I hadn't realized. All doubts gone. Jack was my enemy. Harris's notebook wasn't just survival rules against some unknown threat. It was a detailed guide to surviving one specific person, Jack. Every rule was based on his habits, his methods. And now I understood the scariest rule of all. Never trust a voice over the radio claiming help is near. If I called for help, Jack would hear it, and he would arrive long before any real rescue team. He would come to silence me forever. I was trapped, and now I knew the name of my jailer and executioner. I looked north, toward the old hunting ground with the primitive human traps where Harris had warned me not to go. My last chance, he had written. I realized I had to break the very first, most important rule I'd read, because now it was also my last chance. Answers, survival, or death, it all lay in the north. The decision was made. Sitting in the cabin, waiting for Jack to decide I'd become too much of a problem, was the same as signing my death warrant. After our last conversation, I knew my time was running out. He knew I suspected something. Soon he would come, not with a bell, not with a voice in the fog, but with his rifle. I didn't sleep that night. I prepared. Fear hadn't gone anywhere, but now it was sharp, cold, and mobilizing. It had become survival instinct. I was no longer prey, I was becoming the hunter. I packed my backpack. Only the essentials, cartridges for Harris's old Remington in the corner, a knife, compass, small supply of canned food, water flask, first aid kit. I reread the notes in the small notebook, trying to map out the northern section. Harris mentioned the Black Creek that would lead to the hunting ground. My plan was simple, desperate, and insane. Reach the traps, find what Harris had hidden or discovered, something he saw as his last chance. If I was lucky, I could use it against Jack, then break through, not returning to the post, heading south around Jack's territory toward the next post Merkulov had mentioned. Tens, maybe hundreds of miles through wild woods, but the only path to survival. At dawn, when the first gray rays barely pierced the thick canopy, I left the cabin. On the table, I left a kerosene lamp burning on a low wick, radio left on. This would buy me extra time, create the illusion I was still there. I moved north fast and as quietly as possible, stepping on moss and pine needles. The rule, "don't approach the old traps in the north," now rang in my mind not as mystical advice, but as sober warning. Harris hadn't wanted a random person caught, but he went there himself, so it must have been worth it. The forest looked different now. I no longer saw hostile magic. I saw cover, dangerous open spots, read the tracks in the damp soil. I was becoming part of this forest. After 2 hours of continuous walking, checking the compass, I reached the creek with icy black water. The place earned its name. I followed it upstream. The terrain grew wilder, tangled with fallen trees. It felt untouched by anyone except animals, and maybe Harris himself. Finally, the forest opened up. I stepped onto a vast, swampy clearing overgrown with tall, dry grass and sparse, stunted trees. The hunting ground. It looked ominous. Oppressive, dead silence hung over it. I pulled out the old binoculars I had found in the cabin and began scanning the clearing. And then I saw them and my blood ran cold. These weren't just traps for raccoons. In several spots the grass was trampled, and beneath I could make out camouflaged pitfall traps. From one protruded the tip of a sharpened stake. Between two old birches, a barely visible steel wire was strung at ankle height. I followed it with my eyes. It led to some mechanism hidden in the branches. These weren't simple hunting traps, they were human traps, cruel, primitive, deadly. And I realized they weren't set by Jack. In desperation, Harris had placed them himself, trying to protect his last line of defense. I skirted the clearing along the forest edge, careful not to step onto the open ground. At the far end, under the roots of a massive overturned pine tree, I found what I was looking for. The soil here was different, looser, the turf uneven as if it had been recently dug up and put back. A corner of faded, dark tarp peeked out from under a layer of moss. My heart pounded in my throat. I pushed the old hunting rifle aside and began digging with my bare hands through the moss and soil. The tarp lifted easily. Beneath it was a shallow, hastily dug pit, and in it I recoiled, pressing a hand to my mouth to stifle a scream. In the pit, in an unnatural pose, lay a man. It was Harris. I recognized him by his old field jacket and gray beard. His body was already decayed, but on his chest was a dark, coagulated bloodstain and a gaping wound. Everything fell into place with crushing clarity. Jack hadn't just scared him, he had tracked him down and killed him. Cold-blooded, executed him and then buried him here at the edge of the trap-laden clearing, hoping no one would ever come. Harris hadn't come here seeking answers. He had come to die. He had fled here. This was his last refuge, his fortress. But Jack had caught him before he could finish his work. I stood over the improvised grave, shaking, not with fear but with rage, cold and all-consuming. All the ghost stories, all the local lore, all the psychological terror, it had been nothing but the cynical game of a murderer covering his tracks. And then behind me a branch snapped sharply. I spun around instinctively, reaching for my rifle, but it was too late. 10 meters away, leaning against a pine trunk, stood Jack. On his shoulder hung a powerful scoped rifle, the same one. His face showed no surprise, no anger, only a tired, almost contemptuous disappointment. "I warned you," he said quietly, almost kindly, and that calm tone was scarier than any scream. "Told you not to stick your nose where it doesn't belong, and yet you came. Stubborn, just like that old fool." He nodded toward the grave. In an instant the world shrank to this clearing, the man with the rifle and the grave behind me. Fear and rage gave way to icy, ringing calm. Adrenaline flooded my veins, sharpening my senses. There was nowhere to run. The clearing ahead was a death trap. Jack stood by the only safe exit. He had the powerful weapon with optics. I had an old, cumbersome rifle behind me, out of reach. No chance. "You killed him," I said. My voice didn't waver. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. "He brought it on himself," Jack shrugged, keeping his piercing light eyes on me. "We worked here together for 10 years, quietly, peacefully. I tended my traps, he tended his. Nobody bothered anyone. Fur, rare animals for private collectors, business, good money. Then he got old and conscientious, started keeping records, gathering evidence. Said he'd tell everything, had to put him down. Permanently. He spoke of killing a man he'd worked with for a decade, as if describing putting down a rabid dog. Pragmatically, without remorse. And the bell, the voice in the fog, that was all your show?" I asked, inching a centimeter to the right toward a thick shrub. "I needed cover. A show," Jack smirked. "Very effective for city boys like you. Read all that nonsense, believe in forest spirits and ghosts. A couple of weeks of fear and you're running out, heels flying, telling nobody to avoid seeming crazy. Easier and cleaner than digging a new grave each time. But you too curious. Too damn curious." He slowly, deliberately, lifted the rifle from his shoulder. I understood I had only a few seconds. "You think I didn't know about these traps?" I shouted, trying to buy a moment, make him hesitate. "These," Jack sneered at the clearing. "Child's play. Harris went mad in his last days, left these here. My traps, you wouldn't even notice them." At that moment I did the only thing I could. I didn't reach for my rifle. I lunged sharply into the thick brush, and a deafening shot rang out. The bullet whined past my head, splintering bark from the tree I had just stood behind. I rolled behind a massive tree, scrambling to think my next move. My heart was hammering. He was a professional, a killer. I was a programmer who had only ever fired in video games. "Don't make it harder," Jack shouted from somewhere to my right. He was circling me. "I know this forest like the back of my hand. Every bush, every pit. You won't escape." Harris's traps flashed in my mind. They were my only chance to use the old man's legacy, his anger and desperation. I took a few deep breaths to steady myself. I peeked out for a split second from behind the tree. Jack advanced slowly, moving from cover to cover, rifle ready. I fired blindly in his direction. The shot went nowhere, but it made him duck and bought me precious seconds. I ran, not from him, but into the heart of the trap-filled clearing. "Idiot," I heard him scream behind me. "You'll kill yourself." It was a mad, desperate gamble, but my only move. I ran, leaping over fallen logs, weaving between the trees. I remembered the thin wire I had seen earlier and slipped past it by mere feet. Jack, confident in his knowledge of the forest and my city boy recklessness, chased me, closing the distance. He was so focused on me, his easy prey, that he stopped watching his own steps. And then I did it. I tripped deliberately over a root and let out a loud yell as I fell to the ground. Jack, seeing me fall and seemingly defenseless, lunged forward to finish the job. He jumped over the very log I had tripped on. His foot caught on a thin steel wire, almost invisible in the grass. There was a sharp, dry snap of a breaking catch. From above, among the dense spruce branches, something huge and dark came crashing down with a whistling roar. A massive, gnarly log, spiked with jagged branches like pikes, fell. Jack barely had time to raise his head and utter a startled shout. The impact was brutal. The log smashed into his shoulder and leg, throwing him to the ground like a rag doll. His rifle skidded away. I scrambled to my feet, breathing hard. Jack lay on the ground, alive but in agony. His leg was twisted unnaturally, and his face was contorted with unbearable pain. Harris's trap had worked. The old ranger from his grave had taken his revenge on his killer. I slowly approached and picked up his powerful rifle. He looked up at me, not with hatred, but with pure, animal astonishment mixed with pain. The master of this forest couldn't believe a city boy had outsmarted him. "You how?" he rasped. "This is for Harris," I said quietly. I took his radio, ammo, and knife. I didn't leave him to die. I wasn't like him. Using a strap from his own belt, I fashioned a tourniquet on his shattered leg to keep him from bleeding out, then left him there, taking both rifles and heading back to the cabin. The walk was long, but I no longer feared anything. The forest was silent, but this silence felt different, not hostile, but calm, as if it had exhaled, relieved that its greatest predator was finally stopped. Back at the outpost, I collapsed onto the bench. My body ached from tension, but my mind was crystal clear. I had survived. I had won. Taking Jack's radio, I contacted the rescue. My voice was steady, businesslike. "This is Cole. Urgent. Emergency on my sector. I found the body of former Ranger Harris West. He was murdered. Suspected killer Jack Turner. He's detained, injured but alive. Appears to be the head of a large poaching operation. Coordinates." I gave the exact coordinates of the spruce grove. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the radio. "Cole, are you sure?" Mercer's voice was stunned. "Absolutely. Send a helicopter and preferably the police. This is serious." I waited, sitting in the cabin, flipping through Harris's journal. I remembered the old field jacket I had removed from his body before covering him back up. I reached into its inner pocket and found a folded sheet of paper wrapped in plastic. What Jack hadn't found: Harris's last page, his will. In meticulous handwriting, the sheet outlined the entire poaching network. Names of accomplices, transport routes, dates, sums. Harris had been methodical, meticulous. He had collected all the evidence needed to put Jack and his gang behind bars for years. This note was his final bullet, fired from the grave. At dawn, I heard the long-awaited thrum of rotor blades growing louder, slicing through the morning silence. A large orange and blue helicopter descended onto the clearing, its powerful downwash flattening the grass. Men in camouflage and police uniforms poured out. I handed Harris's note, both rifles and the journal. I recounted everything, from the night of the bell in the fog to the fight in the spruce grove. They listened intently. "Wait, Cole, I still don't get one thing. I sent a helicopter for Harris when he supposedly requested to go to town. Pilot Simmons personally reported he picked up the old man, said he was tired, mumbled about grandchildren but was safe and unharmed. So he lied to me." Then I understood everything. I pointed to one of the last lines on the note. "Third from the bottom, Simmons, pilot, transport." Damn! It all clicked. Jack had killed Harris long before I arrived, then called his accomplice, who staged the evacuation, and reported a sentimental departure. The entire masquerade was designed so the outpost could officially be vacated, making room for a new, unsuspecting person, me. Hours later, the task force returned from the northern sector, escorting a limping, bandaged Jack. His face was gray with pain and impotent rage. They loaded him into the helicopter, then carried Harris's body, covered in tarp. As we lifted off, I looked down at the outpost, just a small cabin on the edge of an endless green sea. A place that almost became my grave, but ultimately gave me more than just the money to pay off debts. I looked at my hands, scraped, but no longer shaking. My contract was over before it truly began. I received not only my promised payment but a substantial bonus for assistance. The money was more than enough to clear my debts and start over. Jack's entire gang was captured, every last one. Harris's note became the linchpin of the case. I returned to the city, but it felt like a different place. Or maybe I had become a different man. The hum of traffic no longer felt like the music of life. The concrete jungle was the only true habitat. Yet sometimes, as I drift off to sleep in my quiet new apartment, I still hear the wind rustling through old spruce branches. But I no longer fear the silence. I've learned to listen to it. And I know this for certain. The scariest monster isn't the one hiding in the fog, ringing a bell. The scariest monster is the one who looks like a man and speaks to you over a radio, calling himself a friend.